The runway lighting was upgraded in October 2023, 3 years after the incident. There were 37 other recommendations made, and they are all available in the final report that I have linked in the video description. If you like this video, here is another story about an Air India Boeing 777 that lost all navigation instruments and was stuck in the clouds, unable to land in New York City. I'll see you there. The crew were carrying out their pre-flight checks when the captain got an update from Air India Express. The company had added an extra flight to the schedule and had to change the captain's roster. He was originally supposed to be on standby duty the next day, but under the new schedule, he was now asked to fly a flight to Doha at 8:30 in the morning. Company policy required a minimum rest period of 12 hours between flights, and after adding extra time for preparation and travel, the minimum gap needed between the captain's 2 flights was 15 hours. Since his Dubai flight that day was scheduled to return at 7:01 p.m. IST, the Doha flight the next day was moved from 8:30 in the morning to 10:00 in the morning to create a 15-hour gap. But what this meant was that any delay to the landing time of this flight at Calicut would delay the departure of his flight to Doha the next day. This last-minute assignment put extra pressure on the captain to land back at Calicut on time. This was a reason for the captain's anxiety when the boarding of passengers in Dubai was delayed. Now, back to Dubai. 184 passengers and 10 infants boarded the flight and were eager to return to India after spending an uncertain 6 months in Dubai. The pilots pushed back as soon as the doors closed, and they departed Dubai at 10 Dia Music UTC, destination Calicut. Calicut is located on the Indian peninsula. It receives a large amount of rainfall because of its closeness to the Western Ghats in the east and the Arabian Sea in the west. It is one of the wettest cities in India, and August is the peak season for the southwest monsoon, which brings the city most of its rainfall. And on the day of the incident, the city was being hit by heavy rain. The possible alternate airports for Calicut were Tiruchirappalli, Coimbatore, and Kochi. They chose Kochi as the alternate, since both cities are on the same side of the Western Ghats. The weather in Kochi was very similar to that of Calicut. It was raining, and the visibility was 2,500 meters, 3.5 hours after leaving Dubai, and while 52 nautical miles from Calicut Airport, the pilots contacted ATC, who reported that the visibility at Calicut was 1,500 meters with a moderate thunderstorm, and surface winds at 270 degrees at 14 knots. Calicut Airport is also going to play a very important role in this story. This airport has what is called a tabletop runway. It was built by cutting off the top of a hill to create a flat tabletop. These runways have steep drops at both ends and on the sides. At the end of runway 10, the ground drops 110 feet. Here is a video of an Airbus landing on the runway, and you can clearly see how steep the edges are on this runway. Calicut Airport is non-standard in many ways. Every runway has a runway end safety area, or RESA. The RESA is meant to help stop airplanes from going past the runway. RESAs are supposed to be 90 meters by 90 meters, but because there was not enough land, the width of the RESA here varied between 71 meters and 85 meters. The airport also has a non-standard runway width. Because of land restrictions, the airport was approved to have a runway width of 75 meters. The standard minimum width for a runway is 140 meters. The runway lighting at the airport was also non-standard. Again, because there was not enough land, the approach lights of the runway, which pilots used to see and locate the runway, were allowed to be only 150 meters long. The standard length of approach lights is 900 meters. Because this runway is so non-standard, Calicut Airport is classified as a critical airport, which means that only the captain is allowed to operate the flight from this airport. The co-pilot can only be the pilot monitoring. Calicut Airport was under 2 active aerodrome warnings, one for rain and another because the wind was stronger than 17 knots. The conditions were so dangerous that the airport had already placed fire engines at fixed points along the runway. During the approach, the plane was flying in light rain and moderate turbulence. Now, we already know that the plane failed to stop on the runway once it landed at Calicut. To better understand why, you need to understand the different systems available to a pilot to stop a plane. Here is a quick guide. The first are the speed brakes. Remember when, as a kid, You put your hand out of a car window and felt the force of the wind on your hand? You could feel the resistance. That is exactly what a speed brake is. If your hands were large enough, that wind resistance could stop the car, and we can use that same idea to stop a plane. Once the airplane touches down, the computer senses the force on the wheels and immediately raises large panels above the wing, which increases drag and lowers speed. The second are the reversers. During normal flight, the engines create thrust in one direction, which moves the plane in the opposite direction. But when the reversers are turned on, a panel in the engine opens and directs the engine output in the opposite direction. This makes the plane want to go backward, which slows it down. The reversers are not deployed automatically and must be turned on by the pilot flying. The third is manual braking. This is similar to how you stop a car. The pilot can press the brake pedals to apply manual braking and bring the plane to a stop. And the last is auto braking. Because pilots have a heavy workload during landing, airplanes are designed to brake by themselves. For this, the pilots need to set the auto brake system to one of 4 values. These 4 values decide how quickly the plane will stop. When max is selected, the plane will stop in the shortest distance possible, and when 1 is selected, the plane will stop more gradually. But when the pilot brakes manually, the auto brake is automatically turned off, and the computer gives full braking control to the pilots. Now, in order to know what flap settings and auto brake values to use, pilots are required to calculate a landing distance required value during every approach briefing. This must be done every time because no 2 approaches are ever the same. There can be differences in weather, aircraft weight, and flying style that need to be considered. But on this approach, these pilots did not calculate it. The captain had flown 36 flights in and out of Calicut Airport in the past year, and he chose the auto brake and flap settings from memory. The plane was cleared for an ILS approach for runway 28 at 13:44 UTC. The approach for runway 28 required the plane to fly to the VOR, fly over the runway, then fly outward for a certain distance, make a U-turn, and then attempt the approach on runway 28. ATC informed the crew that the runway visibility was 2,000 meters and was falling to 2,500 meters. The wind was blowing from 280 degrees. There was light rain and the runway surface was wet. The captain was worried about visibility and told the first officer to make sure the windshield wipers were working. "You just see that this works, remember? Put it to high." And a minute later, he said, the first officer turned the wipers on. Both the captain and the co-pilot saw the runway lead-in lights, and at exactly the same time that they saw the lights, the captain's windshield wiper stopped working. Wiper is gone. What a day for the wiper to go. Because visibility suddenly became worse after the wiper stopped, the captain could no longer see the runway, and so he decided to go around. They pressed the toga switch, applied maximum power, and carried out the go-around procedure. The aircraft was then cleared by ATC to climb to 10,000 feet. Now, there was a chance here for the accident to be avoided, but it was not taken. Air India Express operating procedures require that if the windshield wipers are not working during rain, then the plane must divert to an airport where it is not raining. Remember, Calicut is a critical airport, and so the pilot monitoring was not allowed to land the plane even if he had a perfectly working wiper. Kochi, their chosen alternate, also had rainy conditions. The nearest airport with clear weather was Coimbatore. They had enough fuel to divert to their alternates. Fuel was not an issue, but at no point did the captain or the first officer discuss the idea of diverting. At the same time all of this was happening, an Air India Airbus A320 with the call sign Air India 425 was getting ready to take off from Calicut, headed for Delhi. The current active runway was runway 28. But the pilot of Air India 425 asked ATC for permission to take off from runway 10 instead. This was because there were active rain clouds in the direction of runway 28, and the Air India plane wanted to avoid them. ATC accepted this request and immediately changed the active runway from runway 28 to 10 and gave Air India 425 taxi clearance to the runway. ATC then asked the crew of Air India Express 1344 whether they would like to use runway 10 as well, and reported that the current wind was at 270 degrees at 8 knots. So I have been mentioning the wind speed and wind direction quite a few times in this video. Why are wind speed and wind direction important? Let's take a look. Airplanes usually land and take off into the wind. This is also called a headwind. This is because the aircraft's wings depend on the speed of the air moving over them to lift the plane off the ground. Here is an example. This is a small Cessna 172. The takeoff speed is about 55 to 60 knots. Keep an eye on the windsock at the back. It will show you how fast the wind is blowing. I am going to park the plane and then increase the wind speed to 55 knots. And as I keep increasing the wind, at one point the plane just starts to fly. I admit, it is not stable because I am not controlling it. But this is a good example to show that it is not the ground speed of the plane on the runway, but the speed of the wind over the wings that matters. The stronger the wind over the plane, the shorter the takeoff or landing distance. For example, here the takeoff distance was 0 meters. Now let's flip the wind direction. The little plane now has a tailwind. The wind is blowing from right to left, and as you can see, when I start increasing the wind speed, the wind pushes the plane forward. It does not fly. So to stop this plane, I need to press the brakes harder to fight against the wind, which means that if I land with a tailwind, I am going to need a much longer landing distance to bring the plane to a stop. So at this point, ATC has asked the pilots whether they would like to land on runway 10 instead of runway 28. Runway 10 was the worst of the two runways. It does not have lead-in lights, and they would also be landing with a tailwind, which would increase the landing distance. But on the other hand, remember, the captain is under pressure to make sure his flight the next day is not delayed. He needs to land this plane on time. He was already half an hour late when he took off from Dubai, and he has now spent extra time because of the go-around. If he were to land on runway 28, he would have to once again intercept the VOR, fly back over the runway, make a U-turn, and then attempt the landing on runway 28. There is also the concern that the weather system they are in right now could move over the runway while they are setting up for runway 28. Visibility is 2,000 meters. Wind is at 260 degrees at 5 knots. Considering all this, they decide to land on runway 10, and for the second time that day, no landing distance calculation was done. The pilots did not brief each other either. The flap and auto brake settings were set from memory. The crew chose flaps 30. The correct setting for this approach was 40. The crew chose auto brake 3. The recommended value was max. At 14 hour UTC, Air India Express 1344 was then cleared to approach runway 10. 1 minute later, the Air India flight to Delhi departed from runway 10. And by this time, the wind speed had doubled to 10 knots and was gusting from 270 degrees. At 14:06, the aircraft was established on the localizer. The captain then told the first officer, "I'll tell you when to put it on. I hope it works." He was talking about the windshield wiper. A minute later, the wiper was turned on, but it was working at a much slower speed. ATC cleared them to land on runway 10 with a visibility of 2,000 meters and a wet runway surface. During landing, the plane needs to follow the glide slope. The glide slope is an imaginary 3-degree line from the end of the runway that planes follow for a normal landing. When the plane is on the glide slope, the pink diamond will be centered. The farther the diamond is off-center, the farther away from the glide slope they are. Things are going to start happening very fast now. The already heavy workload on the crew is increasing a lot. The first officer disconnected the autopilot at 500 feet above the ground. The pitch of the plane decreased and the descent rate began to increase, reaching 1,500 feet per minute. The ideal descent rate is 750 feet per minute. The first officer warned the pilot about the high descent rate. Rate of descent, check. They were now 1.5 nautical miles from the runway. The airplane was well below the glide slope and was too close to the ground. The ground proximity warning system warned them with a glide slope warning. The plane was around 2 dots away from the glide slope. This had now become a very unstable approach. Noticing that the captain had not reduced the descent rate enough, the first officer warned him again. Rate of descent, Captain. Yeah, correcting. It is time we talked about the final player in this incident. The first officer. The first officer was a 32-year-old man. He had a total flying experience of around 2,000 hours, having joined Air India Express just 2 years before the incident. The first officer was flying with a captain he had never flown with before. With a captain who was almost twice his age, who was a former Indian military pilot, and who was also a training captain within the company, while the co-pilot himself had just 2 years of experience in the cockpit. The power difference here was significant. Rate of descent, Captain. Yeah, correcting. The captain corrected the descent, and the plane briefly went slightly above the glide slope. The plane crossed the threshold of runway 10 at a height of 92 feet. The engine thrust was at 61%. The auto throttle was commanding a reduction in thrust to land the plane, but the captain increased the engine thrust to 83%. This caused the plane not to touch down, and instead it floated above the runway for the next 5 seconds. The first officer tried to get the captain's attention by saying, "Just check it." At this point, the aircraft was 2,500 feet from the start of the runway, and the touchdown zone would end in 500 feet. The touchdown zone is a marked area on the runway where the plane needs to land in order to give the pilots enough distance to come to a stop. By not touching down in time, the plane was using up valuable stopping distance. Remember, this plane is landing on a wet runway and with a tailwind, both of which increase the landing distance, so it was important that they got this right. Also remember, these pilots had not calculated their real landing distance during the approach, so they were basically just guessing. 2 seconds later, the captain reduced the thrust to try to get the wheels to touch the ground, but the plane had already passed the end of the touchdown zone. The first officer gave a weak call. "Captain, go around!" When a go-around call is made by either pilot, a go-around must be carried out. Also, after 2 go-arounds, the pilots must divert to an alternate airport and cannot attempt a third landing. But the captain here is under pressure not to delay the landing so that his flight the next day can take off on time. If he goes around now, he will have to divert to Coimbatore, so he ignores the go-around call. Because of the strong power difference in the cockpit, the co-pilot does not override the captain and carry out the go-around himself. The plane touched down on the runway 1 second after the go-around call was made, at 14:10 UTC. The plane was traveling at around 165 knots at this point, and it had already used 4,438 feet of the available 8,158 feet. The captain then applied maximum manual braking. The speed brakes were automatically deployed. The first officer made the required call-outs: speed brake up, auto brake disarm. But the captain did not answer these call-outs. After 3 seconds, the captain deployed the thrust reversers, but then shut them off within 2 seconds before they had any effect. And at the same time that he shut off the reversers, he lifted his feet from the brake pedals, which reduced the braking effect. It is likely that he was unsure about whether to go around, but it was too late to spool the engines back up, and at the same time, the plane was not stopping in time. He then applied the thrust reversers again. When the reversers reached maximum, the plane was already beyond the end of the runway and inside the RISA. Both pilots said it had exited the runway at a speed of 85 knots, much higher than what the RISA was designed for. It broke the ILS antennas and a fence before falling down the cliff at the end of the tabletop runway. The plane fell 110 feet down the cliff. Sadly, this impact caused the deaths of 21 people, including the 2 pilots. The main cause of the accident was found to be the pilot flying not following established procedures and not going around when the approach became unstable. The investigation team also found system failures in the airline's training and rostering procedures and in the airport's design and certification as contributing factors to the incident. The investigators found that Air India Express did not have its own simulators and was instead using those of Air India. And those simulators were poorly maintained and had many problems in how they performed. Because of this, the pilots were learning incorrect techniques in the simulator, what the industry calls negative training. Recommendations were also made to improve the runway lighting at Calicut Airport and to increase the RISA at both ends of the runway. The runway lighting was upgraded in October 2023, 3 years after the incident. There were 37 other recommendations made, and they are all available in the final report that I have linked in the video description. If you liked this video, here is another story about an Air India Boeing 777 that lost all navigation instruments and was stuck in the clouds, unable to land in New York City. I'll see you there.